Lecture 8, Homer The Odyssey.
Welcome back to Lecture 8, in which we're going to continue our discussion of Homeric epic by looking at the Odyssey. And I want to look at the Odyssey in terms of its treatment of the human condition and particularly of the necessary acceptance of mortality, just as I did with the Iliad. These themes, the acceptance of mortality, what it means to be human, are no less important in the Odyssey than they were in the Iliad, but the focus is different. Both epics, both the Iliad and the Odyssey, present human mortality as something that must be faced and accepted without any compensation from outside human life itself. Again, the afterlife as it exists in the Homeric worldview offers us no recompense, no compensation for mortality. So mortality has to be faced and dealt with within the confines of human life itself. And this is foregrounded in the Odyssey no less than in the Iliad. In fact, in both of these epics, the main character, Achilles in the Iliad, Odysseus in the Odyssey, is somehow set aside from humanity, isolated and alone. Achilles' isolation, of course, is self-chosen. He withdraws to his tent, he refuses to fight, and so forth. Odysseus' isolation is imposed upon him during his 10 years of wandering after the war. He spends 7 of those years as a captive on the island of the nymph Calypso. But in both epics, despite the different settings, the main character is isolated from the rest of humanity, alone, without help from others. In both epics, the resolution depends on the main character's willing acceptance of mortality and his reintegration into humanity through that acceptance. I talked in the last lecture about how Achilles' encounter with Priam leads to his acceptance of mortality and to his reintegration into his own society. In this epic, we'll see how it works with Odysseus. But there are some major differences because the Iliad focuses on the losses inflicted directly by death, particularly by the death of others, the death of comrades. But the Odyssey, it seems to me, meditates instead on accepting the losses inflicted on us by life, loss of youth, loss of time, acceptance of our unfilled aspirations that they will remain unfilled, those sorts of things. Now, there's certainly a lot of death in the Odyssey as well. Odysseus loses all his companions on the way home from Troy. All his men are lost in one disaster after another. But the main point that I want to focus on here is Odysseus's acceptance not just of his own mortality, but of everything that implies for the rest of his life, for while he is still alive. Achilles' main task, as we talked about in the previous lecture, was to accept the loss of Patroclus, the death of another whom he dearly loves. Odysseus's main task is to accept his own mortality, and he does this in the face of an offer of immortality from the nymph Calypso. She offers to let him stay on her island with him forever, and she says she will make him immortal and ageless. He chooses not to accept that. Odysseus is an important character in the Iliad. He's renowned for his cleverness, his skill in rhetoric. The Odyssey recounts his adventures after the Trojan War. Now, we know from various other sources and from references in the Odyssey itself that many of the Greeks had great difficulty in returning home from Troy. Agamemnon made it home, but upon his arrival back home, he was murdered by his wife Clytemnestra and her lover Aegisthus. Menelaus and Helen were driven off course and were marooned or isolated for 7 years in Egypt before they finally made it back to Sparta. Many of the other Greeks died on the way home, were lost at sea. But Odysseus's difficulties in making the journey home from Troy were without question the greatest of all. It took him 10 full years to make the journey back. Thus, by the time he arrived back on his home island of Ithaca, he had been absent for nearly 20 years. The Odyssey describes both his wanderings during his 10 years of absence and the dangers he faces in reclaiming his family, his home, and his kingdom upon his return to Ithaca. Now, the narrative structure of the Odyssey is very complicated. This is not a straightforward chronological telling, beginning with the day Odysseus leaves Troy and ending up with the day he's reunited with his wife Penelope. Instead, the bard, the poet, plays around with the structure in some very surprising ways. The first 4 books of the 24 books of the Odyssey. The first 4 books are concerned primarily not with Odysseus at all, but with his son Telemachus. Books 1 and 2 show us Telemachus at home on Ithaca, on Odysseus' home island. And Telemachus is a young man of about 20. He was an infant when Odysseus went to Troy, so he's now a young man, a grown man. Books 3 and 4 show Telemachus traveling to visit 2 of Odysseus' comrades from the Trojan War, Nestor, the oldest and wisest of the Greeks, and Menelaus, back home now in Sparta with Helen. Telemachus goes to visit these 2 old comrades of his father. In Book 3 and 4, he's seeking news of his father. He wants to try to find out what has happened to Odysseus. So the first 4 books of the Odyssey focus on Telemachus, Odysseus' son. In fact, they're often referred to as the Telemachy. If the Odyssey is the story of Odysseus, the Telemachy would be the story of Telemachus. And that's a term that scholars often use to refer to the first 4 books of the Odyssey. Books 5 through 8 take up Odysseus' own story. At the beginning of Book 5, we see Odysseus on Calypso's island. He's being held captive by this nymph. A nymph is a minor goddess who wants to make him her husband. She wants to keep him there with her forever and make him immortal and ageless so that he can be her husband and live with her forever. At the beginning of Book 5, at Zeus's command, Calypso lets Odysseus go. Athena, who is Odysseus' patron goddess, points out to Zeus that it's time for Odysseus to go home. Zeus sends a messenger to Calypso. The god Hermes serves as a messenger, and Calypso agrees that she will let Odysseus go. From Calypso's island, Odysseus journeys to another island called Scheria, which is inhabited by a people called the Phaeacians. And these people are famous for providing ships for stranded travelers. They will, and they do, give him a ship to take him back home to Ithaca. So books 5 through 8 get Odysseus from Calypso's island, where he's been captive for 7 years, back to Scheria, from where he will be sent home to Ithaca. Now, books 9 through 12 are a flashback to Odysseus' earlier adventures, the adventures he had between the time he left Troy and the time when he arrived on Calypso's island. So books 9 through 12 give us all the swashbuckling, fantastic fairy tale-like adventures of the Odyssey. These are the books that feature the most famous adventures. This is the part of the text that people normally think of when they think of the Odyssey. It's in books 9 through 12 that Odysseus meets and blinds the Cyclops Polyphemus, son of the god Poseidon, which, by the way, motivates all his later troubles. Poseidon, the sea god, hates Odysseus and so won't let his journey home prosper. It's in books 9 through 12 that Odysseus has to sail between Scylla and Charybdis, meets the Sirens, goes on a journey to the underworld to talk to the dead, and so forth. And these books 9 through 12, are narrated in the first person. Odysseus tells his adventures to the people of Scheria, the Phaeacians. He tells them his adventures in the hope of winning their goodwill so that they'll give him a ship to send him home. Then the story shifts to third-person narration again and to purely chronological order again in Book 13, where Odysseus finally arrives back home on his home island, Ithaca. Then the second half of the Odyssey, books 13 through 24, are concerned with Odysseus reintegrating himself into his society, getting into his palace, being reunited with his wife and son, and so forth. So a purely chronological arrangement of the Odyssey would put books 9 through 12 first, followed by books 5 through 8, followed by books 13 through 24. Books 1 through 4, Telemachus' adventures, happen in the same time frame as books 5 through 8. So as I say, it's a very, very complicated structure. There are probably many reasons we could think of for why a bard would choose to arrange his work this way, but one obvious point is that by delaying Odysseus' entrance for 4 full books, the bard lets us see just how badly Odysseus is needed back on Ithaca. The bard lets us see how Odysseus' family and his society, his family and his community, have both suffered through his absence. For Odysseus' family, primarily here I'm thinking of his wife Penelope and his son Telemachus, but he also has an aged father, Laertes, still alive on Ithaca. For Odysseus' family, the fact that they cannot know if he is alive or dead is not only emotionally wearing, it also causes severe practical problems. They do not know how to order, how to arrange their own lives. Odysseus's wife Penelope is being courted by over 100 young suitors, young men from Ithaca and the surrounding islands who want to marry her. Now, if she is a widow, if Odysseus is dead, Penelope has a clear duty to remarry while she's still just young enough to have children with her new husband, to leave her household as it is to Telemachus, let him inherit his father's house. It is her duty, if Odysseus is dead, to remarry and form a new family. But if Odysseus is alive, it is no less clearly her absolute duty to remain faithful to him and wait until he comes home and protect the household for him until his return. And Penelope has no way of knowing if Odysseus is alive or dead. So she has no way of knowing which of those two duties she should act upon. Odysseus' son Telemachus is in a somewhat similar position. He doesn't know if he is guarding the kingdom for his absent father, if he is in effect acting as a steward, taking care of the kingdom until his father comes back, or if he is himself king, who should assert himself as such and assert his rights over the rulership of Ithaca. And Odysseus' absence causes great problems for his whole community, in part because the Odyssey, and for that matter the Iliad as well, take it absolutely for granted that monarchy is the only form of government around. A society must have a king. Odysseus is king of Ithaca, so this is a society that has, in effect, been without its government, been without its king for 20 years, and has suffered great disarray as a consequence. The focal point for the disarray in Ithaca, the way Homer shows us just how disordered things are in Ithaca, is the suitors, that group of young men who are trying to marry Penelope. As suitors, they're destroying Odysseus' household and threatening his marriage. Let me explain what I mean by destroying his household. They've basically moved in. They're there all the time. Telemachus asks them to go away, they won't. They're eating Telemachus' food, drinking his wine, harassing his mother, seducing the women servants. They're basically just causing complete disorder and disruption in Odysseus' household, as well as trying to marry Odysseus' wife. And implicit in their suit is the idea that whichever one of them does, in fact, marry Penelope will become ruler of Ithaca. So they're not only threatening Odysseus' rights to his wife and to his kingship, they're also threatening Telemachus' rights to his inheritance. Their complete disregard of the proprieties. Again, Telemachus asks them to go away, asks them to go to one of their own houses, eat their own food, drink their own wine for a change. They completely ignore this request. They threaten to kill Telemachus. Their wanton disregard of the proprieties can be seen as a result of the disordered state of Ithaca, of a society that's been without its rightful ruler for 20 years. And just to make the tension all the greater, Homer starts the Odyssey at the precise point where things are coming to a crisis, where the situation is building to a head. Because now that Odysseus has been gone for 20 years, Telemachus is grown. While Telemachus was a child, Penelope could more or less put on hold her decision of whether to remarry or not. She could focus on bringing up her son, taking care of him, maintaining that household, whether she was maintaining it for her absent husband or for her minor son. Either way, her duty was to maintain that household. But now Telemachus is grown. If Penelope is a widow, she should step out of the way and let him claim his kingdom. But she doesn't know if she's a widow or not. Similarly, from Telemachus' point of view, he is no longer a child. He needs to assert his rights, his authority, but he doesn't know exactly what kind of authority he has to assert. Is he crown prince or is he king? And so 20 years is just the point at which things are gathering to a head, when Odysseus is needed home badly and needed home now. So the first 4 books show us that. They hammer home to us just how desperately needed Odysseus is on his own island. Our first view of Odysseus himself comes in Book 5, when Calypso, the nymph who's keeping him captive, approaches him and says to him that he may leave her island. She tells him that she's changed her mind, she'll let him go. Zeus has ordered her to do so. The interaction here in Book 5 between Odysseus and Calypso foregrounds what I've been calling the human condition, and particularly Odysseus's understanding of its implications. As I've already mentioned, Calypso has offered Odysseus, during his captivity of 7 years with her, she has offered him the chance to become immortal, become a god, stay with her forever, be young and carefree and happy on a desert island with a beautiful goddess as his wife forever. Sounds horrible, right? Odysseus turns her down. He chooses to remain human and to return home. Now, Greek mythology is filled with stories of humans who try for immortality, who try to gain immortality. The dividing line, the primary dividing line between gods and humans in Greek myth and the Greek myth worldview is that gods cannot die and humans must die. And there are many, many stories of humans who try to gain immortality. These stories almost always end disastrously, but the point is that Greek myth recognizes that most of us at least think, as Gilgamesh did, that we would like to live forever. So by rejecting Calypso's offer, Odysseus is rejecting what many characters in Greek myth think they desperately want, and he's doing so because he not only accepts, but desires the human condition. His desire to return home is a desire, in effect, to return to his full humanity, to return to his selfhood. Odysseus, isolated from Penelope, Telemachus, his father Laertes, his home, his people, is in a very real sense not Odysseus at all. And faced with this choice, remain young and immortal forever, but do not be Odysseus any longer, or be who you are, which includes knowing that you must die and that all you love must die, he chooses to be Odysseus. He chooses to be human. He's offered what Gilgamesh went on a journey to seek, and he refuses it because he realizes that it is not the right state for him or for any human to be in, and Odysseus wants to be Odysseus. Odysseus wants to be human. Our knowledge of the situation on Ithaca reiterates Odysseus' own sense of urgency in his desire to return home. He not only wants to go home, he wants to go home as quickly as possible, and not just for understandable reasons of homesickness after 20 years. He knows how badly he's needed on Ithaca, because as Odysseus himself tells us in Book 11, he visited the underworld as part of his travels. He went to the underworld to speak to the soul of the prophet Tiresias, one of the greatest prophets who had ever lived. And Tiresias told Odysseus that suitors would court his wife Penelope. So in those 7 years that Odysseus has been sitting captive on Calypso's island, which happened, of course, after his trip to the underworld, during those 7 years, he has not only missed his family, he has known that his family is under direct threat from other men who are trying to marry Penelope and probably to get rid of Telemachus. So his longing for home is increased by his fear of what's happening in his absence. Now, as I already said, books 9 through 12, in which Odysseus narrates his own wanderings, are the more famous part of the Odyssey. But for what I'm trying to do in this lecture, the more important section is the second half of the Odyssey, books 13 through 24, which show us what happens once Odysseus is back on Ithaca. The second half of the Odyssey differs noticeably from the first half in its pace. It slows down markedly. Basically, all that happens in the last 12 books of the Odyssey is that Odysseus returns home to Ithaca. The goddess Athena disguises him as a beggar. He gets into the palace without anyone knowing who he is. With Athena's help, he kills all the suitors, and he and Penelope are reunited. Now, if this were included as part of Odysseus' own narrative of his wanderings in book 9 through 12, he'd probably spend about 15 lines of poetry on it. Homer spends the entire second half of the Odyssey on just that, if we strip it down to its narrative basis. So the pace of the second half of the Odyssey slows down markedly. And also, the kind of challenges Odysseus faces are very, very different in the second half of the Odyssey from the first half of the Odyssey. Odysseus is still in grave danger. These suitors who have been plotting to kill Telemachus would certainly not hesitate to kill Odysseus if they knew who he was. And there are over 100 of them, there's only one of him. So if he just walks into his palace, opens the door and says, "Penelope, I'm home," he's going to be killed by the suitors. He is still in grave danger of his life, just as he was when he fought the Cyclops, just as he was when he sailed through Scylla and Charybdis, just as he's been over and over again in his wanderings. But the dangers he faces are no longer dangers from supernatural forces, hungry monsters, lustful goddesses. Rather, they are mundane, everyday dangers of men who want his wife trying to kill him. And the way he has to avoid this danger is first and foremost not through physical prowess, not through fighting, though he does fight the suitors when it comes down to it, but rather the main thing he has to do in the second half of the Odyssey is exercise extreme self-control. Athena disguises him as a beggar. I'll come back to that point in just a minute. And in disguise, Odysseus is first reunited with his son Telemachus and then with his wife Penelope. He first meets the suitors in disguise. He has to exercise extreme self-control, not to show by any facial expression, by any tone of voice, by anything at all, that he is who he is. So when he's insulted by the suitors, when he sees his family for the first time in 20 years, he can't let any emotion show, because he has to keep his identity secret. So he's still undergoing extreme danger, and he's still having to exercise extreme virtuosity to overcome that danger, but the type is different in the second half of the Odyssey from the first half of the Odyssey. Now, as I just said, when Odysseus first arrives back on Ithaca, Athena disguises him as an old beggar, and she advises him to go stay with one of his very few loyal servants. One of the few slaves who has remained loyal to Odysseus is an old swineherd named Eumaeus. Athena advises Odysseus to go stay with this loyal swineherd. Athena is Odysseus' patron. He's her particular favorite. He doesn't know it. We as the audience know it. She's already helped him on his way home. As I already mentioned, it was she who advised Zeus to send a message to Calypso saying it's time to let Odysseus go. From Odysseus' point of view, he hasn't seen Athena for 10 long years. She helped him at Troy. He doesn't know that she's been behind the scenes since. But now on Ithaca, her help is crucial because she can disguise Odysseus. She makes him look older and uglier than he is, and she disguises him as a beggar. And being a beggar is the one crucial element of this disguise. If you think about it, as a beggar, Odysseus can enter his own palace unannounced, unnoticed by the suitors. Nobody will look at him and think, now who is that and what is he doing here? A beggar is doing what a beggar would always be doing at the rich people's feast. He's begging for scraps of food. It makes perfect sense. He can come into the palace without anyone wondering who he is or why he's there. And furthermore, I think this is a very important point. Nobody will look very carefully at him. How carefully do we look at beggars? When a panhandler comes up to one of us on the street and asks for change, do we really look at that person carefully? Do we really notice them at all? I think not, actually, most of the time. So a beggar can get into the palace, can scope out the situation, talk to the suitors, talk to Penelope even, perhaps, as in fact he does, and nobody will in any way question what he's doing there. So Athena disguises Odysseus as a beggar. Odysseus goes to the hut of the swineherd Eumaeus, and there in Book 16, he's reunited with his son Telemachus. I want to focus now on 2 reunion scenes. Odysseus' reunion with Telemachus in Book 16 and his reunion with his wife Penelope in Book 23. Both of these reunions are very, very important for my theme of the way the Odyssey foregrounds the inevitable losses that life inflicts upon us, as well as the loss of death itself. Odysseus' reunion with Telemachus takes place when Athena brings Telemachus back from his visit to Sparta and tells him to go see the old swineherd Eumaeus in Eumaeus' hut. So Telemachus comes in. Odysseus is there in disguise as a beggar. Eumaeus, of course, recognizes Telemachus immediately. Eumaeus knows Telemachus perfectly well. Odysseus, in character as a beggar, must sit there, watch Eumaeus jump up, say to Telemachus, "Telemachus, you have come back." This is the first time Odysseus has ever seen his son in 20 years, the first time he's seen him since infancy, and Odysseus has to suppress all emotion during this first sight of his son, which he successfully does. Finally, in Book 16, Telemachus sends Eumaeus to the palace. He asks Eumaeus to go tell Penelope that he, Telemachus, is back home safely. Athena beckons Odysseus out into the courtyard. Telemachus can't see her, but Odysseus can. Athena tells Odysseus, reveal your true identity to your son. Tell Telemachus who you are. And she taps him with her wand, makes him younger and handsomer again. So when he comes back into the hut, he no longer looks like the old beggar. Telemachus sees an old man walk out into the courtyard, a much younger man come back in. And Telemachus, understandably, doesn't believe Odysseus when Odysseus says, I am your father. Telemachus thinks this must be a god. Humans don't normally change appearance like that, so Telemachus thinks this must be a god. Now, Odysseus cannot prove to his son who he is. He can only say to Telemachus, I am your father. He says, interestingly enough, no other Odysseus than I will ever come back to you. Telemachus simply has to take him on faith. And once Odysseus has explained that it was Athena who disguised and undisguised him, Telemachus accepts Odysseus' identity, and the two weep in one another's arms. And Homer, the bard, uses here a remarkable simile to describe their weeping. Homeric epic, the Iliad and the Odyssey both, is very rich in similes. Here, the bard says that Odysseus and Telemachus embrace and weep. And the bard says that they weep and they cry. They cried shrill in a pulsing voice, even more than the outcry of birds whose children were stolen away by the men of the fields before their wings grew strong. Such was their pitiful cry and the tears their eyes wept. When I teach the Odyssey, I always ask my students, why are they crying? Aren't they happy to see each other? And someone always, or two or three someones often, come up with what I think is exactly the right answer. They're weeping for all that they've lost. They're weeping for those lost 20 years. And that's where the point of the simile comes in. Just as the birds have lost their fledglings from their nest, Odysseus has lost his child. He left an infant, he came back to a young man. In a very real sense, Odysseus never has a child. That's gone, and that can't be given back. And I like to put this scene in direct contrast with Athena's reaction when Odysseus first arrived back on Ithaca. Odysseus asked Athena, basically, where have you been for 10 years? Why did you let me take 10 years to get home? Why didn't you help me? Why didn't you get me off Calypso's island 7 years ago? And Athena offers him no explanation except she says, I knew my uncle Poseidon, my father's brother Poseidon, was angry at you because you blinded his son the Cyclops, and I didn't want to quarrel with my father's brother, and I knew you'd make it home eventually. I never had any doubt that you'd make it home eventually. Athena, an immortal goddess, outside the bounds of time and the bounds of aging, doesn't seem to get it, to use the modern phrase, that 10 years earlier or 10 years later makes all the difference in the world to human beings. From her point of view, she says, I knew you'd get home eventually, so what did it matter? From Odysseus' point of view, Penelope's, Telemachus' point of view, 10 years. What did it matter? It would have made all the difference in the world. And so when you compare Athena's treatment of Odysseus' absence with the tears that Odysseus and Telemachus weep, that, I think, brings into sharp focus what the difference between immortal gods and mortal humans is, as the Odyssey presents it. Well, with the help of Athena, Telemachus, Eumaeus, and one other loyal slave, Odysseus kills all of Penelope's suitors, and then he is finally reunited with his wife Penelope near the end of the Odyssey after 20 years of absence. When Penelope first approaches Odysseus after he has slaughtered the suitors, she doesn't immediately recognize him. She sets him a test. She says that she's going to have their marriage bed moved out into another room so that he can sleep in the bed that he himself built, but not in their bed chamber. This is a test because this bed is rooted into the ground. Odysseus himself built it with one of the posts, a living olive tree. He knows that, he describes the bed, and this allows Penelope to recognize him. When she recognizes him, no one else but Odysseus would know the secret of this bed. When she recognizes him, the bard once again uses a wonderful simile to underline their reunion. He says that Odysseus wept as he held his lovely wife, whose thoughts were virtuous, and as when land appears welcome to men who are swimming after Poseidon has wrecked their ship on the open water, so welcome was her husband to her as she looked upon him. Odysseus was as welcome to Penelope as land is welcome to a shipwrecked sailor. This brings the two halves of the Odyssey, Odysseus' wanderings, Penelope's waiting, together in a simile that describes her joy at seeing him to his joy at reaching dry land after wandering. And they weep as they hold each other. So both of these reunion scenes are marked by sorrow as well as by joy. Both of them reflect the reality of human life in all its complexity, in stark contrast to what Odysseus would have had if he had accepted Calypso's offer of immortality. In its story of a man choosing to return to his humanness rather than becoming an ageless immortal, the Odyssey affirms the importance and the worthiness of being human. To be human means to be entwined in sorrow, aging, disease, death, all of those forms of loss, but it's only through those that we can be human, and only in contrast to those that we can know the joy that we do find in being human. And that, I think, is what the Odyssey foregrounds more beautifully than any other text I know. So in this lecture, we've finished our examination of Homeric epic by looking at the Odyssey. In the next lecture, we'll turn to a completely different form of Greek poetry, lyric poetry, or poetry written from the personal viewpoint of the poet.